The cold metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the gilded dining room of Aura, silencing the clinking of crystal and the murmur of New York's elite. One moment, Clara Bellwether, a 20-year-old waitress with charcoal under her fingernails and dreams of art school in her heart, was clearing dessert plates. The next, she was the center of a spectacle of shame, her face illuminated by the flashing blue and red lights filtering through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. Her manager, a woman named Eleanor Vance, stood beside two uniformed NYPD officers, a look of venomous triumph on her perfectly made-up face. In Eleanor's gloved hand, held up for all to see like a holy relic, was a small, antique silver locket. "We found it in her apron pocket, officer," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying across the stunned room. She must have panicked when she realized we were searching everyone. Clara's world tilted, the faces of the wealthy patrons blurring into a gallery of judgment. She wasn't a thief. She was a ghost, a pair of hands meant to be invisible as she served their $300 entrees. But now they saw her, and they saw a criminal. She thought she was powerless, a nobody about to be swallowed by the system. She didn't know that the locket they were holding, the one thing she owned that mattered, was about to trigger an avalanche. She didn't know that sitting at table 12, watching this entire drama unfold with a gaze as sharp and cold as cut diamond, was Arthur Sterling, a man who didn't just dine in the city's power centers, but owned the steel beams and concrete foundations they were built on. The restaurant wouldn't just be getting a bad review. By the end of the month, it would be a crater on the corner of Park Avenue. The evening had started like any other Tuesday at Aura, a temple of gastronomy, where the price of a single tasting menu could cover Clara's rent for 3 months. The air was thick with the scent of white truffles, expensive perfume, and the low hum of deals being made. The clientele was a curated collection of Wall Street titans, aging socialites, and tech billionaires who wore hoodies that cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. They were the people who moved the world, and Clara was the person who refilled their water glasses. At 20, Clara lived a life of stark contrasts. By night, she navigated the treacherous currents of fine dining, balancing trays of seared foie gras and memorizing the vintage of a Bordeaux she could never afford to taste. By day, she filled sketchbooks with the city's faces, her true passion. She was an artist, a portraitist of uncanny ability. She saw the minute details others missed, the faint scar above a banker's lip that betrayed a childhood accident, the subtle twitch in a lawyer's eye that signaled a lie. The way a society wife's smile never quite reached the desperate sadness in her eyes. Her observations were her secret language, a way of understanding a world that seemed determined to overlook her. She worked at Aura for one reason: tuition for the Cooper Union School of Art. Every dollar she earned, every painful smile she offered to a condescending patron, was a brushstroke on the canvas of her future. Clutched in her pocket beneath her server's apron was her touchstone, the one thing that connected her to a past before this grueling present. A small, silver locket, tarnished with age. It had been her mother's, a struggling musician who had died when Clara was 10. Inside were 2 impossibly small, faded photos, one of her mother, the other a tiny, blurry snapshot of her father, a man she'd never known. The locket wasn't just jewelry. It was the entire archive of her history, the only proof of the love that brought her into the world. Her manager, Eleanor Vance, was a woman sculpted from bitterness and ambition. In her late 40s, she ruled Aura's dining room with an iron fist clad in a velvet glove. She saw the world as a rigid hierarchy, and she was obsessed with her place in it. She fawned over the wealthy patrons, her voice dripping with a sycophantic sweetness that turned to acid the moment she addressed her staff. She particularly despised Clara. She couldn't stand the girl's quiet dignity, the way she never broke under pressure, and most of all, the smudge of charcoal that sometimes lingered on her hand, a sign of a life and a passion that existed outside the gilded cage of aura. To Eleanor, Clara was dirt on a polished floor, a constant reminder of the lower rungs she had clawed her way up from. Tonight, the pressure was immense. Table 12 was occupied by Arthur Sterling, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence in every boardroom in the country. Sterling was the founder of Sterling Industries, a vast conglomerate that had started with a single patent for a new type of structural steel and had grown to encompass everything from aerospace engineering to advanced robotics. He was a widower, famously private and notoriously ruthless in business. He was dining with his daughter, Amelia, a young woman with a kind smile who was celebrating her 21st birthday. Clara was assigned their table. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached. Arthur Sterling was an imposing figure, with a severe face, greying temples, and eyes that seemed to analyze everything they saw with unnerving precision. He looked less like a man enjoying a meal and more like a general surveying a battlefield. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling, Ms. Sterling. My name is Clara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. Amelia smiled warmly. "It's a pleasure, Clara." Arthur Sterling just grunted, his eyes already scanning the wine list. He was gruff, dismissive, the kind of man who expected perfection and offered no praise when he received it. Clara had served his type before. Head down, be efficient, be invisible. That was the key. She performed her duties flawlessly. She described the specials with quiet confidence, decanted a 1982 Chateau Margaux with a surgeon's steady hand, and ensured their water glasses were never less than half full. During a quiet moment, while father and daughter were deep in conversation, Clara pulled out the small, worn sketchbook she kept in her apron. It was a compulsion. She had to capture the lines on Arthur Sterling's face, the deep furrows in his brow that spoke of immense pressure, the hard set of his jaw that hinted at a lifetime of fighting. She made a quick thumbnail sketch, just a few lines, focusing on his eyes. They were the most interesting part of him, intelligent, weary, and fiercely protective when they landed on his daughter. She also noted a detail about his custom-made suit, the lapel pin, a small, intricate gear, a nod to his engineering roots. The evening wore on. The Sterlings were on their dessert course when the chaos began. It started not with a shout, but with a theatrical gasp from table 7. A woman named Beatrice Dubois, a regular whose wealth was exceeded only by her penchant for drama, shot to her feet, her hand flying to her earlobe. "My earring! My diamond earring is gone!" she shrieked, causing a ripple of alarm to spread through the dining room. Eleanor Vance glided to the table instantly, her face a mask of grave concern. "Mrs. Dubois, please calm yourself. When did you last see it?" "It was there a moment ago. I felt it. Someone must have taken it." Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, and like a hawk spotting a field mouse, they landed on Clara, who was clearing plates from a nearby table. It was the perfect opportunity. For weeks, Eleanor had been looking for a reason to fire Clara, to rid her perfect dining room of the girl's quiet, artistic presence. Now, she could do more than fire her. She could destroy her. "Stay calm, everyone," Eleanor announced, her voice ringing with authority. "For the safety of our guests' property, we will be conducting a brief search of all staff members currently on the floor. It is a simple precaution." A wave of humiliation washed over the servers and busboys. They were being lined up like criminals. One by one, they emptied their pockets onto a linen-covered service table under Eleanor's watchful eye. Keys, loose change, pens, notepads. When it was Clara's turn, she placed her sketchbook, her tips, and a pen on the table. Her heart pounded. This was wrong, deeply wrong. Eleanor patted down Clara's apron with a little too much force. Her fingers paused, then her eyes lit up with a malevolent spark. "Well, well, what have we here?" She reached into Clara's side pocket and pulled out the small, silver locket. She held it up. It wasn't a diamond earring. It was something far more personal, and in Eleanor's hands, far more damning. "This is not Mrs. Dubois' earring," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "This is something else entirely. An antique by the looks of it. Something a little waitress like you would have no business owning." Clara's blood ran cold. "That's mine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was my mother's." "Your mother's?" Eleanor scoffed, turning to the room. "A likely story. I suspect you saw your chance with Mrs. Dubois' distraction, got scared, and tried to hide this. You probably have the earrings stashed somewhere else. You're a common thief." "No!" Clara's voice was stronger now, fueled by a surge of desperate adrenaline. "That locket has been in my family for generations. It's all I have of her." The patrons were watching, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. At table 12, Amelia Sterling looked horrified. Arthur Sterling, however, remained impassive, his face unreadable. He watched Eleanor, then Clara, his gaze analytical, as if observing two components of a complex machine, one of which was malfunctioning catastrophically. He was used to people trying to scam him, to play on his sympathies. He'd learned long ago to trust data, not drama. And right now, all he saw was drama. "Call the police," Eleanor commanded another waiter. "We will let them sort this out." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. The police. A record. The end of her dreams. The end of Cooper Union. The end of everything. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her, suffocating her. As the sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer and closer, Clara felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. Eleanor had won. The world she had tried so hard to keep at bay had finally broken in, and was about to drag her into the dark. The 10 minutes it took for the NYPD officers to arrive felt like an eternity. Clara stood frozen in the center of the dining room, a pariah in a black and white uniform. The other staff members averted their eyes, afraid to be tainted by association. Eleanor Vance, meanwhile, held court, recounting her version of events to a rapt audience of diners, painting herself as the vigilant protector of Aura's integrity, and Clara as a cunning viper she had bravely exposed. "You have to be so careful these days," she said in a stage whisper to Mrs. Dubois, who was now dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "You let one of them in, and they think they can take whatever they want." At table 12, Amelia Sterling was agitated. "Dad, this feels wrong. That girl, she doesn't look like a thief. And that woman," she gestured toward Eleanor, "is enjoying this way too much." Arthur Sterling took a slow sip of his water, his eyes never leaving the scene. "People are rarely what they seem, Amelia. The world is full of good actors. Let the police handle it. It's not our business." His tone was dismissive, the voice of a man who had built an empire by refusing to get entangled in other people's messes. He had a deep-seated skepticism, a firewall he'd built around himself to fend off the endless stream of people who wanted something from him. He saw a hysterical manager and a crying waitress, a common enough workplace dispute, albeit a public one. Two officers, a veteran named O'Malley and his younger partner, Diaz, entered the restaurant. The room's opulence seemed to dim in their pragmatic presence. Eleanor immediately took charge, leading them to Clara as if presenting a prize catch. "Officers, thank you for your prompt arrival. This is the young woman, Clara Bellwether. We caught her red-handed with stolen property in her apron." She presented the locket to Officer O'Malley. O'Malley took the locket, handling it with surprising gentleness. He was a man in his late 50s with tired eyes that had seen every kind of human desperation. He looked at the locket, then at Clara. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, but her chin was held high. There was a defiance in her posture that didn't quite fit the profile of a common thief. "Ma'am, is this your locket?" he asked Clara, his voice neutral. "Yes, sir. It was my mother's. She gave it to me before she passed away." "And you, ma'am," he said, turning to Eleanor. "You're saying she stole this from whom?" "Well, we were initially looking for Mrs. Dubois' diamond earring," Eleanor admitted, a slight crack in her composure. "But when we found this, it's clearly valuable. She has no reason to possess something like this. It's obvious she's a thief." O'Malley's eyebrow twitched. "So, nobody has actually reported this item stolen?" "It's only a matter of time," Eleanor insisted. "She's clearly hiding something. I want to press charges for theft. I want her arrested." Officer Diaz, the younger of the two, stepped forward, his hand hovering near his handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us down to the precinct." This was it. The point of no return. The cold reality of the situation finally broke through Clara's shock. They were going to arrest her. They were going to put her in a cell. The accusation, the lie, was about to become a permanent stain on her life. And then, something inside her shifted. The artist, the observer who had spent years quietly documenting the world, took over. Fear was replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. Her mind, usually a whirl of colors and shapes, became a high-resolution camera, zooming in on a single, crucial memory from earlier in the evening. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, that no one else could have possibly noticed it. When Eleanor had been fawning over Mrs. Dubois, she had leaned over the table, her expensive crimson cashmere shawl brushing against the tablecloth. Clara, from across the room, had noticed a tiny, almost invisible flaw in the impossibly expensive fabric, a single, loose thread near the fringed edge. She'd even made a mental note of the specific shade of red, a deep carmine with a hint of blue, almost impossible to replicate. Now, as Eleanor stood there, basking in the glow of her victory, Clara's artist eye connected two disparate images, the memory of that loose thread and the locket now sitting in the officer's palm. "Wait," Clara said. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence. Everyone turned to look at her. "Before you take me anywhere," she said, looking directly at Officer O'Malley, "I want you to look at the locket. Very, very closely." O'Malley frowned, intrigued by her sudden change in demeanor. "Look for what, kid?" "Look at the clasp," Clara instructed, her gaze unwavering. "The little hinge where it opens. There's something caught in it, something that wasn't there this morning when I put it on." Arthur Sterling, who had been about to signal for the check and leave this sordid affair behind, paused. He leaned forward slightly, his initial disinterest replaced by a flicker of curiosity. This was no longer a simple denial. This was a specific, testable claim. As an engineer, he dealt in tolerances, in microns, in the tiny details upon which great structures either stood or fell. The girl was pointing to a detail. Officer O'Malley, humouring her, brought the locket closer to his eyes, squinting under the dim restaurant lighting. "I don't see anything." "Use the light on your phone," Clara urged. "It's tiny. It's a fibre, a single, microscopic fibre." Officer Diaz, rolling his eyes, pulled out his phone and shone the flashlight beam onto the locket in his partner's hand. The room held its breath. O'Malley's eyes widened slightly. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "There is something here. Looks like a piece of red thread." Eleanor Vance's triumphant smile faltered. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. It probably came from her uniform, from a napkin, from anywhere. "No," Clara said, her voice ringing with the conviction of absolute certainty. She turned her gaze from the officer and locked eyes with her manager. "It's not from a napkin. It's a cashmere fibre, a specific shade of carmine red. And it's from the frayed edge of the shawl you were wearing tonight, Miss Vance. The one you're wearing right now." A collective gasp went through the room. Every eye swiveled from Clara to Eleanor, and then to the crimson shawl draped elegantly over Eleanor's shoulders. The manager's face, which had been flushed with victory, was suddenly ashen. She instinctively clutched the shawl, a gesture of self-preservation that looked suspiciously like guilt. Arthur Sterling was now fully engaged. The entire equation of the situation had been rewritten. The crying, helpless waitress had just presented a piece of forensic evidence with the precision of a crime scene investigator. She hadn't just claimed innocence. She had constructed a logical, evidence-based accusation against her accuser. The engineer in him was deeply impressed. The father in him, watching his own daughter watch this display of courage, felt a stir of something else entirely. Respect. "Officer," Arthur Sterling's voice boomed across the silent room. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound carried an implicit weight of command that silenced all other noise. "I think the young lady has made a valid point. It would seem the provenance of that fibre is of critical importance." He stood up from his table, a towering figure of authority. He walked calmly toward the group. Eleanor Vance looked like she was about to faint. "Perhaps," Sterling continued, his cold eyes boring into Eleanor, "before you arrest this employee for theft, you should be investigating the manager for planting evidence and making a false report." Officer O'Malley looked from the locket to Clara, to the now panicked Eleanor, and finally to Arthur Sterling, a man he recognized from the cover of Fortune magazine. The power dynamic in the room had just shifted with the force of a tectonic plate. This was no longer a simple case of a waitress and a stolen trinket. This was something much, much bigger. The atmosphere in Aura had transformed from a stage for public shaming into a courtroom, and Eleanor Vance was suddenly, terrifyingly, in the defendant's box. Her carefully constructed world was cracking at the seams. "This is absurd," she sputtered, trying to regain control. "She's a liar, a manipulative little—" "A little what, Miss Vance?" Arthur Sterling's voice was soft, but it had a menacing edge. "A little girl who happens to have the observational skills of a trained intelligence agent? That's quite a coincidence." Officer O'Malley, a man who knew which way the wind was blowing, turned his professional attention fully onto Eleanor. "Ma'am, I'd like to take a look at that shawl of yours." "You will not touch my personal property," Eleanor shrieked, clutching the fabric to her chest. At that moment, Mrs. Dubois, who had been watching the scene with a dawning horror, let out a small cry. She had been rummaging in her diamond-encrusted clutch purse, the one she'd insisted had been searched earlier. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her face turning a shade of red that clashed with Eleanor's shawl. She pulled out her hand. Dangling from her fingers was the missing diamond earring. It must have gotten caught in the lining," she stammered, looking mortified. I am so sorry." The final pillar of Eleanor's story had just crumbled into dust. There was no initial theft. The entire premise for the search had been a lie, a drama orchestrated by Mrs. Dubois, which Eleanor had then hijacked for her own malicious purposes. Eleanor stood exposed, her lies unraveled by a microscopic thread and a woman's careless mistake. The patrons who had been watching Clara with suspicion now stared at Eleanor with undisguised contempt. The hunter had become the prey. "Ma'am," Officer O'Malley said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us to answer a few questions about filing a false police report and tampering with evidence." Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. The mask of superiority fell away, revealing a face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage and fear. "You can't do this! Do you know who owns this restaurant? He's a very powerful man. He will have your badge." Arthur Sterling let out a short, humorless laugh. "Please tell me his name. I'm always interested in meeting powerful men. Perhaps we have some business interests in common." The implied threat was unmistakable. Whatever power the owner of Aura had, it was nothing compared to the man standing before them. Eleanor stared at Arthur, the realization of who he was and what she had done finally crashing down on her. She hadn't just picked a fight with a waitress. She had, in her arrogance, taken a swing at a god of this city's pantheon. As Officer Diaz gently but firmly took her arm, Eleanor's eyes, wild with desperation, found Clara's. The hatred in them was palpable. It was a look that promised retribution, a look that said, "This isn't over." But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She stood tall, watching as her tormentor was led away. She had faced down the monster and won, not with power or money, but with the truth, sharpened to a fine point by her artist's eye. Officer O'Malley walked over to Clara and handed her back the locket. Its silver surface felt warm in her trembling hand. "I'm sorry for the mix-up, miss. You've got a good head on your shoulders." Clara clutched the locket to her chest, the wave of relief so overwhelming it almost buckled her knees. She had her mother back. She had her name back. Arthur Sterling watched her for a moment longer, a thoughtful expression on his face. He then turned to his daughter. "Amelia, let's go. I've lost my appetite." He walked to the front desk, where the restaurant's owner, a slick man named Julian Croft, who had materialized from his office in a panic, was profusely apologizing. Sterling ignored him. He placed a black credit card on the counter. "Pay the bill. Include a $5,000 tip to be given directly, and only to Ms. Bellwether," he said, his voice flat and final. He then looked Julian Croft dead in the eye. "And I would suggest you find a very good lawyer. You're going to need one." Without another word, Arthur and Amelia Sterling swept out of the restaurant, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos and the lingering silence of a world that had been irrevocably upended. Clara stood alone in the middle of the room, the locket in one hand, a check for $5,000 in the other, and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that her life had just changed forever. The storm had passed, but she could feel the tremors of the earthquake that was yet to come. The aftermath in Aura was a quiet implosion. The remaining diners, their appetites ruined by the raw display of cruelty and justice, quickly settled their bills and fled into the night, eager to gossip about the scandal they had just witnessed. Julian Croft, the owner, alternately sweated and shivered, making frantic phone calls to his legal team. The staff whispered in hushed tones in the kitchen, a mixture of awe and fear in their voices. Clara was the reluctant hero of the hour. She was allowed to clock out early. As she changed out of her uniform in the cramped staff locker room, her body still humming with adrenaline, the head chef, a gruff but fair man named Antoine, stopped by. He pressed a container into her hands. It was a perfectly seared piece of halibut with saffron risotto, the night's most expensive special. "You eat," he said in his thick French accent. "You have more courage than anyone in this place." It was the highest praise he could offer. Clara walked out of the restaurant's service entrance into the cool Manhattan air. The city felt different, the cacophony of sirens and traffic, now a backdrop to the quiet hum of her own thoughts. The $5,000 tip felt like a lead weight in her pocket. It was more money than she had ever seen at one time, a significant step toward her tuition goal, but it felt like blood money, payment for her own public flogging. She was halfway to the subway station when a long, black town car pulled up beside her. The tinted rear window glided down, revealing the stoic face of Arthur Sterling. Amelia was beside him, her expression soft with concern. "Get in, Miss Bellwether," Arthur said. It wasn't a request. Hesitantly, Clara opened the door and slid onto the plush leather seat. The inside of the car was silent and smelled of wealth. "Are you all right?" Amelia asked, her voice kind. Clara could only nod, feeling overwhelmed. Arthur Sterling didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What you did in there," he began, his voice raspy, "was remarkable. You didn't panic. You used your head. You presented facts. I respect that. I spent my life building things on facts, on blueprints, on stress test data. Emotion is a variable that leads to collapse. You held on to the structure." I didn't want them to take my locket," Clara said quietly. "Tell me about your art," he said, changing the subject abruptly. Startled, Clara stammered for a moment before finding her words. She told him about her love for portraiture, for capturing the hidden stories in people's faces. She told him about Cooper Union, about the portfolio she was constantly working on, about how the charcoal under her nails was a badge of honor. Arthur listened intently, his gaze analytical. He wasn't offering sympathy. He was assessing her. It was the same look he'd given the wine list, the same look he'd given Eleanor Vance. He was calculating her value. "The owner of that restaurant, Julian Croft, he's a fool," Arthur said suddenly. He allowed a petty tyrant to run his floor and create a liability that is now going to cost him everything. He chose his manager poorly. He will pay the price for that. The way he said it sent a chill down Clara's spine. It wasn't a prediction. It was a declaration of intent. The car pulled up outside Clara's modest apartment building in Washington Heights. Before she got out, Arthur handed her a business card. It was thick, heavy stock, with nothing on it but his name, a private phone number, and an email address. "My foundation offers scholarships for promising young talent in the arts and sciences," he said, his tone all business. "My assistant will be in touch." The silence inside the town car was a physical presence, heavier and more opulent than any quiet Clara had ever known. It absorbed the city's chaos, leaving only the soft hum of the engine and the frantic, syncopated rhythm of her own heart. She sat ramrod straight on the supple leather, the container of halibut a warm, surreal weight on her lap. Arthur Sterling's business card, a sharp-edged talisman clutched in her hand. He hadn't spoken since his terse command to enter the vehicle, and the stillness was a crucible, burning away the last of her adrenaline and leaving behind a raw, trembling exhaustion. Amelia, seated opposite her, offered a small, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her troubled eyes. She looked like a ghost in the ethereal glow of the passing streetlights. It was Arthur who finally broke the tension, his voice not loud, but possessing a density that seemed to alter the air pressure in the cabin. "You have a rare quality, Miss Bellwether," he stated, his gaze fixed on the blur of the city outside his window. It was not a compliment, it was an assessment, like an engineer noting the tensile strength of a new alloy. You observe. People look, they see shapes and colors, but you observe, you deconstruct, you analyze, you find the flaw, you found the single red fiber. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, cold and analytical as a lens, met hers. That is a form of power, a dangerous one if you don't know how to control it. Tonight you used it to save yourself. But power attracts attention. The attention of people like me, and the attention of people like Eleanor Vance. The latter will try to crush it. The former, we will try to use it. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. I just wanted to go home. I didn't want any of this. No one ever wants the earthquake, he replied, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. But it comes all the same. The question is whether you are built on bedrock or on sand. Miss Vance built her life on the sand of other people's fear and her own insecurity. It was always destined to wash away. The only variable was the tide. He paused, letting the metaphor settle in the silent car. I am the tide. The simple, declarative statement was the most terrifying thing Clara had ever heard. It was a confession of immense, casual power, a glimpse into a world where entire lives could be swept away as a matter of course. A part of her, the part that had stood defiant in the center of that dining room, was awed. But a larger part was deeply afraid. She wasn't sure she wanted to be protected by a force of nature so absolute. My foundation, the Helena Sterling Foundation, was established to identify and nurture exceptional talent, he continued, his tone shifting back to the clipped cadence of business. My late wife, Helena, was a painter. She believed that true artists were society's conscience, the ones who saw the cracks in the facade before anyone else. She believed they should be protected, given the resources to work without the compromises of a world that values commerce over truth. He looked at Clara again, and this time his gaze was more intense, more personal. My assistant will contact you. You will submit your portfolio, all of it. Not just the pieces you think are good, but the sketches, the studies, the failures. The Foundation's board will review it. If they find what I suspect they will find, you will be offered a place. Not just a scholarship, Miss Bellwether. A sanctuary. But it must be earned. My wife despised charity. She believed in investment. We will invest in you if you prove you are the bedrock and not the sand. The car glided to a halt in front of her building. For a moment, no one moved. Clara looked from Arthur's granite face to Amelia's compassionate one. They were two parts of a whole, the engine of power and the heart of empathy. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, she whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. For everything. I have done nothing yet, he corrected her. I have merely opened a door. It will be up to you to have the courage to walk through it and the strength to withstand what is on the other side. As she stepped out onto the cracked pavement, the mundane reality of her life rushing back in, she realized his words were both a promise and a warning. The storm of that evening was over, but she was now standing in the eye of a hurricane. The days that followed were a disorienting blur of contrasts. By morning, Clara was navigating the labyrinthine world of Sterling's influence. Miss Davies, a lawyer with a mind like a steel trap and a surprisingly gentle demeanor, met with her in an office overlooking Central Park. The view from the window was a portrait of power Clara had only ever seen from the ground. With quiet efficiency, Miss Davies recorded Clara's statement, insulated her from the press, and handled the formal complaint against Aura. During these meetings, Clara felt like a precious, fragile object being carefully packaged and labeled as evidence. She recounted the story of the red fiber, her voice steady, but felt a growing sense of detachment, as if the brave girl in the restaurant had been someone else entirely. By afternoon, she was back in her small apartment, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil a familiar comfort. She worked on her portfolio with a feverish intensity, sketching the faces of her neighbors, the weary commuters on the subway, the joyful chaos of children playing in a nearby park. Here she was in control. Here she was not a victim or a prodigy. She was just an artist with a piece of charcoal, trying to capture a sliver of truth on paper. The news of Aura's swift, brutal demise reached her in fragments. She saw the headlines on newsstands, catching snippets of conversation in coffee shops. Michelin-starred eatery in freefall after scandal. Health department cites systemic failures at Aura. Park Avenue fixture faces eviction. Each report felt like a distant aftershock from an earthquake whose epicenter had been her own humiliation. There was no sense of triumph, only a hollow, aching sadness. She hadn't wanted a restaurant to die. She had just wanted her locket back. She sketched Julian Croft's face from a grainy newspaper photo, trying to find the man behind the panicked, ruined expression. She found only fear. 2 weeks after the incident, a black envelope bearing the crest of the Helena Sterling Foundation arrived. It was a summons, not a letter. She was to present her portfolio in person at the Sterling Industries headquarters. The building was a monument of steel and glass, a testament to the man who had built it. Clara, carrying her worn leather portfolio, felt like a sparrow flying into a wind turbine. She was escorted not to a boardroom, but to a quiet, private gallery on the top floor. The walls were adorned with breathtaking art, a brooding Rothko, a delicate Twombly, a fierce de Kooning. And in the center of the room, standing before a large ethereal landscape, painting that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, was Arthur Sterling. This was one of Helena's last pieces, he said, without turning around. She was losing her sight to a degenerative condition. She began to paint not what she saw, but what she remembered. She said memory had a brighter palette than reality. He finally turned to face her. "Show me your work." Clara's hands trembled as she untied the leather straps of her portfolio. This was a different kind of judgment, more terrifying than any accusation of theft. She laid her life's work out on a large granite table, portraits of the city's unseen population, the deep lines on a subway conductor's face, the defiant hope in the eyes of a street musician, the exhaustion and love in the face of a young mother. Sterling examined each piece in silence. He spent less time on her more polished, finished works, and lingered over the raw, gestural sketches in the back, the quick, instinctive captures of a fleeting emotion. He stopped at one in particular, a portrait of an elderly homeless man, his face a roadmap of hardship, but his eyes, which Clara had rendered with painstaking care, held a startling, unbroken dignity. Arthur picked it up, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the paper. His expression was distant, his composure momentarily fractured by a memory. "Helena used to disappear for hours," he said, his voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "She would go to soup kitchens, shelters, underpasses, not to volunteer, not to donate, to sit, to listen. She would come back with sketchbooks full of faces like this one." He tapped the drawing. "She said they were the only people in the city who had nothing left to hide. She called them the honest ones." He looked from the drawing to Clara, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her, not just a component in a larger equation. "She had your gift," he said, "this unflinching empathy. She could see the core of a person through all the noise. I built an empire of steel and concrete, things that are strong and predictable. But I could never build a fortress strong enough to protect her from the ugliness of the world. It seeped in. She felt its sorrows too keenly. He placed the drawing back on the table with a reverence that stunned her. The Foundation's board has approved your scholarship. A full endowment to Cooper Union. Housing, supplies, everything you require will be provided. Your only responsibility is to your talent. You will honor it. You will not squander it. You will not compromise. Is that understood? Yes, Clara breathed, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. Do not thank me, he said, his gruff demeanor returning like a shield. Thank your gift. I am merely its steward. Now go. You have work to do. Life at Cooper Union was like learning to breathe in a new atmosphere. For the first time, Clara was not an outsider. She was surrounded by people who understood her language, who debated the emotional weight of a particular shade of blue, who saw the world as a series of compositions waiting to be captured. Her work flourished, gaining a confidence and scale she hadn't known she possessed. Yet, the shadow of her patron was long. She was the sterling scholar. Whispers followed her in the hallways. Some students were envious, others suspicious. She felt the invisible weight of Arthur's expectation in every brushstroke, every line drawn. He never contacted her directly, but she knew he was watching. Occasionally, a rare art book would arrive by courier, or tickets to a sold-out exhibition would appear in her name. They were reminders of her debt, of the tide that had carried her to this shore. She wrestled with this feeling in her art. Her portraits became more complex, exploring the duality of her subjects, the public mask and the private truth. She realized that she, too, was now wearing a mask, that of the gifted, grateful art student. Underneath, she was still the girl with charcoal under her nails, grappling with a miracle she wasn't sure she had deserved. The sight of her humiliation was exorcised from the city's landscape. Aura was gutted, its opulent fittings sold off. A year later, a discreet plaque went up on the renovated facade, the Helena Sterling Annex. It was a new studio and gallery space for the university. Clara walked through the transformed building on the day of its dedication. The air, once thick with the scent of truffles and judgment, now smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Where table 12 had stood, a young sculptor was installing a towering piece of twisted metal that looked like a prayer. She felt a sense of profound, dizzying vertigo. The worst place on earth had become a sacred space. 4 years passed. Clara graduated with honors, her final thesis exhibition causing a stir in the downtown art scene. A prominent gallery in Chelsea offered her a solo show. She had made it. She was no longer the sterling scholar. She was Clara Bellwether, artist. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the district attorney's office. It was a standard form, informing her that Eleanor Vance, who had served 3 years of a 5-year sentence for perjury and filing a false report, was eligible for parole. As the victim, Clara was invited to submit an impact statement. She sat with the letter for a long time, the official language stark against the comfortable chaos of her studio. She thought of writing about the terror, the humiliation, the way the incident had irrevocably altered the course of her life. But the words felt hollow, like a story about someone else. The rage and fear had long since cooled, replaced by the quiet, steady hum of her new life. What was left to say? She made a decision. A week later, she drove 2 hours upstate to the Albion Correctional Facility, a place of grim functionality set against a backdrop of incongruously beautiful rolling hills. Eleanor Vance had aged more than the intervening years could account for. Her hair was shot through with grey, her face was stripped of its old, imperious makeup, revealing a map of bitterness and exhaustion. When she saw Clara sitting opposite her in the visitation room, a plexiglass divider between them, her eyes widened first in shock, then narrowed into the familiar glare of resentment. "What do you want?" Eleanor rasped, her voice rough. "Come to see what you've done? To gloat?" "No," Clara said quietly, her gaze steady. She hadn't come with a speech. She had come with a sketchbook. She placed it on the small counter, though she didn't open it. "I came to see you." "You destroyed my life," Eleanor spat, her hands clenching into fists on her lap. "Everything I worked for, gone. Because of you and your filthy rich friend." "You tried to destroy mine first," Clara replied, not with anger, but with a simple statement of fact. "For a locket. Why, Eleanor? I've never understood why." Eleanor let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You want to understand? You, with your talent, your gift. You think you can understand? You have no idea what it's like to have nothing but your own will, to claw your way up, inch by inch, in a world that only respects money and power. I built that restaurant's reputation. I made it perfect. And you were a stain, a smudge of dirt with your charcoal and your sad little locket, reminding me of everything I'd crawled away from. It wasn't about the locket. It was about the look in your eyes. You never feared me. You just observed me. Like I was a bug under glass, I wanted to smash the glass." In that moment, Clara finally saw her. Not a monster, but a woman terrified of insignificance, so desperate to maintain her precarious perch that she had to annihilate anyone who threatened her sense of order. It was a pathetic, deeply human tragedy. The portrait was finally complete. "He didn't do it for me, you know," Clara said softly. "Arthur Sterling. He did it for his wife. I just reminded him of her." Eleanor stared at her, the fight seeming to drain out of her. "What does it matter?" she whispered. "I'm still in here, and you're out there." "Yes," Clara agreed. She stood up. "I'm not submitting a statement to the parole board. What happens to you now is your story, not mine. I'm done with it." She turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor Vance alone with the ghost of her own choices. Clara didn't look back. She felt no pity, no triumph, only the quiet release of a final brush stroke, the satisfaction of a finished piece. She was free. Her first solo show was titled Bedrock and Sand. It was a collection of large-scale charcoal portraits. The subjects were a study in contrasts: construction workers and CEOs, street performers and socialites. Each was rendered with her signature, unflinching empathy, revealing the shared humanity beneath the surface trappings. The centerpiece of the show was a diptych, 2 massive, identical canvases hung side by side. On the left was a portrait of Arthur Sterling as the world knew him. It was titled The Tide. He was rendered in sharp, architectural lines, a force of nature, his eyes holding the cold, distant light of a star. On the right was the second portrait. It was the same man, but the lines were softer, the shadows deeper. She had captured the profound grief, the weary solitude, the ghost of a memory in his eyes. This one was titled The Steward. Arthur Sterling stood before the diptych for a long time on opening night, the gallery buzzing around him. Clara watched him from a distance, her heart pounding. Finally, he turned and beckoned her over. "You see too much, Miss Bellwether," he said, his voice a low rumble. He was looking at the second portrait. Helena would have loved this. She would have understood it. "I think," Clara said, finding her voice, "she's the one who taught me how to see it." He looked at her, and for the second time in all the years she had known him, a smile touched his lips. It was not the tired, sad smile from before. This one was different. It was a smile of release, of acknowledgement. "My investment," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "has yielded a return beyond any calculation." He held out his hand, not in command, not as a patron, but as an equal. Clara took it. His grip was firm, the hand of a man who built things to last. In the reflection in the gallery window, she saw them, the artist and the engineer, two survivors of their own separate earthquakes, standing together on the bedrock they had found.